Hey, Mr. Howard here to record the read aloud of Chapter 11 of The Picture of Dorian Gray. Chapter 11 is an odd one. We just finished Chapter 10, which showed Dorian becoming more paranoid, not trusting his valet Victor, hiding the picture at the top of his house, deciding that it would show his shame, and that then he got influenced by this book that Lord Henry sent him. And then went to the opera with Lord Henry. The chapter ends with him with Lord Henry sort of abandoning Basil entirely, and vowing to live this life of physical or sensual pleasure, a new hedonism, which is what Lord Henry called it in the beginning. Chapter 11 is a montage chapter. It's a really long chapter. It's about 20 pages long, and it's comparatively dull compared to the rest of the book. The book is founded on dialogue. There is no dialogue in this chapter. It's entirely narration and inner monologue from beginning to end. So if there's a chapter you're going to skip in The Picture of Dorian Gray, it's going to be Chapter 11. That's not to say that Chapter 11 is not important. It is. It substantiates what Dorian Gray's been doing with his life, between the ages of 21 and 30 or whatever. It gives you sort of the influence of the book and Lord Henry continuing on him over that period of time, his paranoia deepening and getting more profound. It also shows him becoming sort of a collector, a connoisseur, but not a connoisseur of art necessarily so much as a connoisseur of sensations. He collects all of these things, and all of them are the five senses. He tastes all the food that can be tasted and smells all the perfume that can be smelled, and, feels all the fabrics and stares at all the light through all the jewels in the world. And all of these things are opulent as well. They show the opulence, the wealth of Dorian as a person. He walks through a hall, too, and looks at pictures of his ancestors. I'm giving you all of this in case you do decide to skip the chapter. You still need to know what happens. And I don't think there's any major spoilers here. He looks at pictures of his ancestors and thinks about their previous traits and what effect they had on him, and tries to exonerate himself from any blame for being the way he is, based on who his ancestors were and how they genetically might have impacted him. And so the chapter goes on like that. It spends a good amount of time talking about the book that Lord Henry gave him and its influence on him. And that is all important from the art as a mirror of your own experience sort of standpoint. I mean, on some level, the picture was a mirror of Dorian Gray when it was made, and Dorian has used art as a mirror and to see himself in an artistic way throughout his entire life. This is going to continue that, except it's the book, not the picture, that is having that effect on him through these chapters. So, like I said, if you're going to skip some chapters, these ones are this one's probably the one you want to skip. But there's a lot of interesting stuff in here. A lot of lists, a lot of material. It's a chapter that is foundational, I think, in the comparison between Dorian himself and Victorian culture, the decadence of Dorian's lifestyle, and the decadence of Victorian culture, the way that Dorian brings in sensations from around the world. He's sort of a hub for international sensations, the same way the British Empire was a world empire. The sun never sets on the British Empire, and it was able to be a connoisseur of world cultures and countries. So a lot of this stuff comes to fruition in this chapter, or the groundwork is laid in this chapter for symbolic readings and understandings of the story. But I'm not going to spend as much time stopping and analyzing because the chapter's so long. And we'll read it and we'll go through it, and I'll give you what sort of quick surface things I discern. Hopefully that'll be enough for you. So, Chapter 11 of The Picture of Dorian Gray. For years, Dorian Gray could not free himself from the influence of this book. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to say that he never sought to free himself from it. I think that's an interesting distinction, an important distinction. He procured from Paris no less than 9 large paper copies of the first edition and had them bound in different colors so that they might suit his various moods and the changing fancies of nature, over which he seemed at times to have almost entirely lost control. Sort of like phone cases where people change them so that they reflect the color of their outfits. Dorian has this book, 9 copies in different colors so they can match it with whatever he's wearing. Also, it seems to suggest that he's lost control over himself and his own lifestyle, maybe due to the influence of the book. The hero, the wonderful young Parisian, in whom the romantic and scientific temperament were so strangely blended, similar to romanticism versus intellectualism or romanticism versus realism, became to him a kind of prefiguring type of himself, a mirror. And indeed, the whole book seemed to him to contain the story of his life written before he had lived it. In one point, he was more fortunate than the novel's fantastic hero. He never knew, never indeed had any cause to know, that somewhat grotesque dread of mirrors and polished metal surfaces and still water which came upon the young Parisian so early in life, and was occasioned by the sudden decay of a beauty that had once, apparently, been so remarkable. It was with an almost cruel joy, and perhaps in nearly every joy, as in certainly every pleasure, cruelty has its place, that he used to read the latter part of the book with its really tragic, if somewhat overemphasized, account of the sorrow and despair of the one who had himself lost what in others and in the world he had most dearly valued. In this case, the protagonist values surfaces. He values beauty, just like Dorian, but Dorian doesn't have to worry about growing old. The tragedy of the book, it seems, is that the protagonist grew old, but Dorian shall not. And so this is the distinct difference between him and the young Parisian in the book that Lord Henry gave him. For the wonderful beauty that had so fascinated Basil Hallward, and many others besides him, seemed never to leave Dorian. Even those who had heard the most evil things against him, and from time to time strange rumors about his mode of life crept through London and became the chatter of the clubs, could not believe anything to his dishonor when they saw him. He had always the look of one who had kept himself unspotted from the world. Men who talked grossly became silent when Dorian Gray entered the room. There was something in the purity of his face that rebuked them. His mere presence seemed to recall to them the memory of the innocence that they had tarnished. They wondered how one so charming and graceful as he was could have escaped the stain of an age that was at once sordid and sensual. Look at some of the language here. Kept himself unspotted from the world. The word purity, escaped the stain. I mean, the contrast of purity and stain, or unspotted and stain, of an age that was at once sordid and sensual. He obviously hasn't, like his soul is changing, but outwardly he's still pure and perfect. He still reflects that sort of Edenic innocence that he had at the beginning of the story. Often, on returning home from one of those mysterious and prolonged absences that gave rise to such strange conjecture among those who were his friends, or who thought they were, he himself would creep upstairs to the locked room, open the door with the key that never left him now, and stand with the mirror in front of the portrait Basil Hallward had painted of him, looking now at the evil and aging face on the canvas, and now at the fair young face that laughed back at him from the polished glass. The very sharpness of the contrast used to quicken his sense of pleasure. He grew more and more enamored of his own beauty, and more interested in the corruption of his own soul. Pause again, a couple of things here. He's looking at the image and looking at the picture and laughing at the contrast. This is different. It's an inversion of what's going on with the protagonist of the book that he's so in love with. That person is in despair and sorrow and crying at the contrast between who he used to be and who he is now, whereas Dorian Gray hasn't aged at all. He looks at his soul and he's like, God, I could look like that, but look at what I actually look like. And when you look at this line, he grew more and more enamored of his own beauty. He's falling more and more in love with himself. He's a narcissist. And more interested in the corruption of his own soul. That implies that he's studying the corruption of his soul in sort of a scientific way. It's not affecting him in any emotional way whatsoever. He would examine with minute care, and sometimes with monstrous and terrible delight. That word monstrous is interesting too. Go back to the Frankenstein comments I made last lecture. The hideous lines that seared the wrinkled forehead or crawled around the heavy, sensual mouth, wondering sometimes which were more terrible, the signs of sin or the signs of age. He would place his white hands beside the coarse, bloated hands of the picture and smile. He mocked the misshapen body and the failing limbs. There were moments indeed at night when, lying sleepless in his own delicately scented chamber, or in the sordid room of the little ill-famed tavern near the docks, which, under an assumed name and in disguise, it was his habit to frequent, he would think of the ruin he had brought upon his soul with a pity that was all the more poignant because it was purely selfish. Pause. So he's leading a double life, not only a double life in terms of his soul and his body, but a double life in his real life as well. He's in disguise, and he has a second life that he lives in an ill-famed tavern near the docks, sort of Jekyll and Hyde-ish, I think, on some level. Also, that when he feels bad for himself, the feeling is a purely selfish feeling. Even his pity is somehow tainted and sinful. And I think that's interesting. But moments such as these were rare. The curiosity about life, which Lord Henry had first stirred in him as they sat together in the garden of their friend, seemed to increase with gratification. The more he knew, the more he desired to know. There's a knowledge statement there as well. The more he learns, the more he wants to learn. He had mad hungers that grew more ravenous as he fed them. Speaking of Lord Henry, you recall Lord Henry's speech on temptation, where he said the only way to get rid of a temptation is to yield to it. If you yield to it, it goes away. Well, this seems to contradict that. That he had mad hungers that grew more ravenous as he fed them. Instead of eating that bag of Doritos and then not having to feel like you want to eat the bag of Doritos anymore, it just makes you want more Doritos. So the sin isn't necessarily a mode of purification, as Lord Henry said. Certainly not for Dorian, and certainly not now. Yet, he was not really reckless, at any rate, in his relations to society. Once or twice every month during the winter, and on each Wednesday evening while the season lasted, he would throw open to the world his beautiful house and have the most celebrated musicians of the day to charm his guests with the wonders of their art. His little dinners, in the settling of which Lord Henry always assisted him, so they're still together, were noted as much for the careful selection and placing of those invited as for the exquisite taste shown in the decoration of the table, with its subtle symphonic arrangements of exotic flowers, and embroidered cloths, and antique plate of gold and silver. Indeed, there were many, especially among the very young men, who saw, or fancied that they saw, in Dorian Gray, the true realization of a type which they had often dreamed in Eton or Oxford days, a type that was to combine something of the true, real culture of the scholar, with all the grace and distinction and perfect manner of a citizen of the world. To them, he seemed to be of the company of whom Dante describes as having sought to, quote, make themselves perfect by the worship of beauty, end quote. Like Gautier, he was one for whom the visible world existed. And certainly to him, life itself was the first, the greatest of the arts. I think it's an important line. Yet for Dorian, life was the first and greatest of the arts. Remember, he's made his life a work of art so that he could be a spectator of his own life instead of an actor in it. And for it all, the other arts seem to be but a preparation. Fashion, by which what is really fantastic becomes for a moment universal, and dandyism, which in its own way is an attempt to assert the absolute modernity of beauty, had of course their fascination for him. His mode of dressing and the particular styles that from time to time he affected had their marked influence on the young exquisites of Mayfair balls and Pall Mall Club windows, who copied him in everything he did and tried to reproduce the accidental charm of his graceful, though to him only half-serious, fopperies. For while he was but too ready to accept the position that was almost immediately offered him on his coming of age, and found indeed a subtle pleasure in the thought that he might really become to London of his day what to imperial Neronian Rome the author of the Satyricon once had been, yet in his innermost heart he desired to be something more than a mere arbiter of fashion, to be consulted on the wearing of a jewel, or the knotting of a necktie, or the conduct of a cane. He sought to elaborate some new scheme of life that would have its reasoned philosophy, its ordered principles, and find in the spiritualizing of the senses its highest realization. This goes back to the garden as well. Lord Henry said that Dorian could be the visible symbol of this new religion, which he called a new hedonism. Hedonism, as you recall, is collecting physical sensations, living by what your body tells you is pleasurable. The idea is that if something is pleasurable, it's good for you. Your body is genetically predisposed to enjoy things that are healthy for it. Now, we all know that's crap, right? Sugar is enjoyable. If you eat too much of it, you get obese. There's lots of enjoyable things out there that aren't necessarily good for you. But hedonism tells you that they are. I mean, on some level, we all crave sugar, right? Because our ancestors were starving. This is an aside. And sugar was a way to produce fat, which would get you through the winter. But now that you have unlimited access to these things, there's no moderation. And so things that would have been positive to your ancient ancestors on the verge of starvation are now negative to us in our modern day. And hedonism, at least Lord Henry's philosophy, doesn't take note of that at all. Anyway, The worship of the senses has often, and with much justice, been decried, men feeling a natural instinct of terror about the passions and sensations that seem stronger than themselves, and that they are conscious of sharing with the less highly